This is Dave, the Guru, and another tutorial using GameSalad. In this lesson, we're going to go ahead and start to look at some of the functions that we can use when addressing tables in GameSalad. So let's go ahead and we're going to go up to our table here, and I've made some modifications, and you're going to see in here I put row and column to identify or name the row and identify the column. Now we can actually address a table cell value using its headers that identify or label it. So let's just grab a display text, and let's go ahead and we'll just grab our normally used function table cell value. So we'll go ahead and we'll grab our table. And so now what we're going to do, instead of addressing the row number, we're going to go ahead and call on the row header. So since we're going to be going after a text value, we need to put quotation marks around text because that's how we tell the system that we're dealing with text. And we're just going to go ahead and type in row, and then we're going to close it with a quotation, and then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing. Close it with a quotation, and then we'll go ahead and close off that expression, and we'll get a little more visible text. And we're going to go ahead and see now we've got 1. So if we go back and look in our table, you're going to see that the value in there is 1. So in the same way, if we change this part here, as I've got the next column labeled as text, you're going to go ahead and see that it's going to show the value of A, which is in that first row, second column. So we're now calling these values by their names, which is great because this really helps you to build more integrated code, because now you can do it by the column or text value, whatever you put in here, and then you can manipulate the rows by their name, which if you were doing a word game, if you organize things really well, when a person put in a particular value in a quiz, you could match it up against right or wrong there simply by using your column and row names to really get that addressed and not having things hand off or translate from a number to a text value. And there are a lot of different ways you can start to mess with this and really start to integrate and really plan out your stuff with tables and really make some great generic code. So now let's go ahead and look at another interesting thing that we can do in that same vein. We can go ahead and call the table column number based on its label. So now we could go ahead and get our table, and if we put the column again in a text value, so let's go ahead and call the text, which will return us the number of the column that is labeled text. And see, there we go. We've got the column number 2. Now there again, this is a great way and an expression that you could use in a rule to call a table or get the number of a particular column, and then use that value in another string of code and passing it around in your code in an integrated way without having all these translations going on between everything. So now also we could do the same for a row. We could come down and get a row number if we addressed our table, and we get the row label, which I called it row. And we'll go ahead and do that, and we'll see that is row 1. So these are the basics of using some of these different expressions that we have. We could also go in and get our row count. So if we just put the table in there and we go to our table, we can get the number of rows that are in our table. Now, this is a great function to use if you're adding rows constantly in your game to store specific bits of information, and you have another rule that you always want it to be looking at the last row. You could use this in your code, in your rule, so that it's always pulling from, or even a change attribute or constraint or whatever it is you're doing. You could always be looking at that last row to pull that particular piece of information, and so you don't have to constantly keep having all these different bits of code that is constantly changing the row that you're looking at. You can just call the last row and say, whatever information in there, do X, Y, or Z. And this is where really tables begins to help us using these expressions that we have, that we can start really integrating our code. Now, let's use this value right here for a minute. And let's just go in and look at our table real quick before we begin. And so I've got an integer here. Let's just call this add. And let's put some values in here. Let's just do ones. That way this makes it a little easier for everybody to kind of see the math without doing all this crazy stuff in your head. And so now what we can do is, using this column sum expression, we can go ahead and actually, it can work with text or numbers. We can go ahead and easily sum up all these values. So we'll go ahead and grab our table, and we're going to go ahead and grab our test table. And so we want to say which column we want to use. So I called that column add. So let's just go ahead and spice it up here a little bit and use some of the tricks that we're learning. And then we need to tell it the rows that we're going to start with. So we could actually, let's mix this up a little bit. So we got row. Okay, that's what I called the first row. And then the last row is not, and let's go ahead and we can say the end row. So let's go ahead down and let's grab another expression and put it in here. And let's go ahead and grab our table row count value. And we'll go ahead and put in our test table. So now you can see we're beginning to mix up these different expressions, these different ways of calling data to basically get a single value. So now if I've done everything right, it should be 9. And there we go, it's 9. So let's say we were, adding rows. Okay, let's open this expression again and just take a peek at it. So if we were constantly adding rows, we could write this single expression here, and we wouldn't have to go back and re-add to this code. It would just automatically always go to the last row. So you could add 100 rows in there. So every time a row is added and a value is added into that row, it would be added to this equation. And so we can begin to see how tables really help us to build open-ended code, or as I like to call integrated code, generic code, whereby we build these strings of code and functions, and we're able to do it in a really confined way, that our code is more generic, and that it starts to expand and extrapolate things on its own without having to layer on all these other, for lack of a better term, translator bits of code that are simply there to take a number value, let's say, and translate that into a text value, or to extrapolate that into another value. You begin to see how with planning and using tables and these different types of expressions, as you mix and match them, you can start to begin really, really integrated code if you plan your code out ahead of time. And really getting the full power of tables really allows you to really build some great, slick, slim, highly functional kind of stuff that expands on its own. All right, so now let's look at another way we can do some values in tables. Let's go ahead and we're going to grab this table merge values expression. So if we look at this, it looks kind of scary. It's actually not. It's pretty simple. Once you get through what they're trying to show you here, it'll make perfect sense. So we're going to go ahead and we'll start with the basics. We're going to just go grab our table. And then we got to determine whether what we're going to be summing is going to be a row or a column. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sum column 1. So we'll go ahead and remove that stuff that we're left with column. And so now we're going to look at what we're targeting here in this. And so we're going to target the column 1 is what we're targeting. And then we're going to need the start range in this area here now, start and end range. Since we're dealing with a column, we're going to be dealing with the range of rows that we want to sum in that column. So if this was a row, then we would be dealing with, this would be the column numbers that we're summing across a row. So we're going to go ahead and we'll start with row 1, and then we'll end with row 9. And what this is going to do is just list everything out. It's not actually going to sum everything. It's going to just merge all these values together and create a string. So now we need a separator in here, and we could just go ahead and put 2 quotation marks which says don't separate these numbers by any kind of indicator. So let's just go ahead and we'll save this real quick, and let's go ahead and look at my table. And you can see I've just got 1 through 9 here. So when we go ahead and preview, what we're going to get is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So now if we went back and we wanted to separate these things, we could go in between our quotation marks, and let's just put a comma in between all of them. And then you're going to see they're all separated by commas. And so you could put any value in their periods, whatever you wanted to put in there. In this merge table values, we can go ahead and merge a bunch of values, which can be important in building word games or whatever. You could even string together a sentence if you built, your code that way with a dictionary. You can basically, this opens up the power to do lots of different things. And we can go ahead and we can sum things in column number, value, all that. And table search, we'll get into that in the next video. It's a little more elaborate, and so we'll need more time to go into that. But this is how we start to use the basic table functions to really build integrated code and really harness the power that is there, and that tables really allow us to do in building very generic integrated code that almost gives your game, your code, a life of its own, to be able to move and expand and adjust without having to have all these layers of code on top of code on top of code that can bring down your frame rate. And it saves you time and in building a game, which is huge. The more time you have, the more games you can crank out in a year. You can find me on the forums under the name Lost Oasis Games. This is Dave, the Guru. I'll see you in the next video.